Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari, and our special guest today is Dr. Matthew Cockle. Welcome, Dr. Cockle.
Hi, Payman. Good to be here.
No, it's good to finally have you on here. I've been I've been trying to get you on here for a while. I don't know if I reached out to you, but I've been following you since your performance at the NCI, and we did a couple of email back and forth. Um, just to move things along, you wanted to come on today to read a letter, and then we'll discuss it. So should we go straight to that letter? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So the letter was penned by Gail Davidson, and Gail is a retired lawyer specializing in international human rights law. She founded Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, and her CV is very long. I'm not going to get into it, but she is an expert in international human rights law, and she is a tireless advocate for democratic governance. So she has penned a letter to Mary Simon, our Governor General, and of course she has attempted to communicate with Mary Simon, but in the past 4 years, as many of us have found, it's very difficult indeed to get those in office, elected representatives, to correspond with those they're supposed to represent. So here is the letter. Open letter to Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, regarding the plan to make Mark Carney Prime Minister of Canada. You must immediately announce that you will not use your position as the Governor General to swear in Mark Carney as the Prime Minister of Canada. National news reports indicate that you will, as the Governor General, swear Mark Carney in as the Prime Minister of Canada, thereby empowering Mr. Carney to exercise the powers of an elected Prime Minister. Mr. Carney has never been elected by Canadians and is not a member of Parliament. No news reports indicate that you will decline to install Mr. Carney as Prime Minister if invited or directed to do so by the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who is himself required to obey the law. Installing Mr. Carney as Prime Minister would violate Canadian law, Canada's international law obligations, including obligations arising from the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the rule of law. Such a gross violation of democracy, rights, and the rule of law could trigger, as warned by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression. Canada is a constitutional democracy, as set out in the Constitution Acts 1867 to 1982. Canada's governing body is Parliament, which is composed of members of Parliament, all elected by Canadian citizens in strict accordance with the provisions of the Canada Elections Act. This planned extraordinary setting aside of democracy and derogation of rights to elections and democratic governance through the appointment of an unelected Prime Minister will take place while Parliament, the Government of Canada, remains prorogued. On 6 March 2025, the federal court ruled that the lawfulness of the Prime Minister's advice to the Governor General can be reviewed and, when contrary to law, be set aside. In that case, the court found that the applicants had not proven that the Prime Minister overstepped his prerogative power to direct prorogation, in part because it was not possible for the court to separate partisan and non-partisan reasons for the prorogation. Advice to appoint Mr. Carney as the Prime Minister does not serve any democratically justifiable purpose. It is not authorized by law and would most certainly not survive a similar legal challenge before an independent judiciary. The plan to appoint Mr. Carney as the unelected Prime Minister may be a death blow to democracy in Canada. Your mandate, Governor General Mary Simon, from King Charles III, directs you to uphold the laws of Parliament and the people and ensure justice for all. Your mandate does not allow or empower you to participate in undermining democracy. Please advise me of the announcement that you will not appoint Mark Carney as Prime Minister or otherwise endow him with parliamentary powers until he has been elected as a Member of Parliament in accordance with the requirements of the Canada Elections Act. Sincerely, Gail Davidson.
Well read.
It's a strong statement, and I think that any Canadian can see we can't have an unelected prime minister. It makes absolutely no sense, and it is so manifestly anti-democratic that we should all be up in arms. We should all be in the streets. We should all be objecting to this. But perhaps after 4 years of constant pressures, of constant attacks on our rights and freedoms, perhaps the population has grown inured, where it's become a habit. It's just another blow. And we don't even duck and cover anymore. We just sort of apathetically accept it as though it didn't make any difference. Well, when you have a prime minister appointed and he's unelected, and he's not some Joe off the street. He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England. And his economic policy was disastrous for England. Obviously, this man who holds 3 passports and hasn't lived in Canada for 11 years, according to the reports I've read, this man represents banking interests, global banking interests. In what world does this appear to be a man for the Canadian people? An unelected man, a man who hasn't lived in Canada for over a decade, a man who served as the governor for 2 national banks, and whose ties clearly are to global banking and such combined sort of forces as the World Economic Forum represents. This is not, I mean, it's an insult to all Canadians that this would even be considered. And the idea that a Governor General should be so uninformed as to her duties with respect to Canadian parliamentary democracy and her role as Governor General, as to even consider appointing this man Prime Minister, it's baffling. But of course, if we stop at bafflement, then we're just engaging in a kind of baby talk discourse, because we're talking about the end of democracy that's happening right in front of our eyes. And, you know, it's reminiscent of the end of T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. And the world in question is Canadian democracy. This is not the way Canadian democracy should be going, and none of us want it to end. All of us recognize that the type of society we want is founded on, it's a rights-based, rule of law, democratic system. So most of us don't know what that means. Whenever this type of language comes up, everybody's a little uneasy. Everybody's been trained to think, well, I'm not an expert, so I have nothing to say. But that's not true. So rights-based means that the structure, the way that our society is run, the fundamental principle from which the governing happens is the preservation of the rights and freedoms of individuals as far as possible. Rule of law, this is a concept that's grossly misunderstood, maybe intentionally, maybe there's an intentional misunderstanding that's being pushed, but rule of law doesn't mean whatever the law is, I do it. That's rule by law. That's the rule of tyrants. That's the rule that takes place in authoritarian states. Rule of law means that everyone in society is equal and equally represented before the law. And that includes persons, whether rich or poor. And that also includes corporations, and that includes the government. And so when you have a system, as we do in Canada, where the federal government is able to go after individuals like Tamara Lich and use enormous resources to crush her and to crush Chris Barber and to crush the people who participated in the Ottawa protests, the Freedom Convoy. And these people, coming from the working middle class, there's a disproportion of means. They cannot adequately defend themselves against this overwhelming force. Well, this is an example where the rule of law is failing. And when the rule of law fails, then we do not have rule of law democracy. And rule of law is absolutely essential to liberal democracies. And that's what we live in, a liberal democracy. And here again, people wonder, and with good reason, what does this mean, liberal democracy? What does it mean to go to a liberal arts school? Well, liberal from not the Liberal Party, then it might mean you go to university and you learn how to take kickbacks and avoid democratic process. But no, it's not that. It's from the Latin liberalis, and it refers to being a free individual. So a free man, a freeholder, being a free, and some might say sovereign, a free individual who is able to participate in the political life of his or her society, who has the education and the ability and the opportunity to do so. And that means actively participating in decisions that involve legislation. And so again, here we're entering into a phase in Canada where the people are being completely cut off from the legislative process. And there's multiple levels to this exclusion of the people from the people's government. Democracy is demos, the people, krati, rule. But if people are trying to write to their elected representatives and they get no reply, and if there's an issue that comes up or there's legislation that's going through and there's no meaningful consultation, then the legislation that's being proposed does not represent the people. And so that's 2 points. I don't want to confuse matters here, but first we have this question of democratic process and the passing of laws. This is under threat in Canada already, and BC is a fantastic sort of example of a province that appears to be entirely disregarding democratic process in its lawmaking. There are 3 enormous acts that have passed in the past few years. And the first one was the Emergency and Disaster Management Act. The second one was the Health Professions and Occupations Act. And the third one is the Legal Professions Act. Now, in order for a bill, which is basically a big folder full of laws, in order for a bill to be passed, a number of things have to happen in a democracy, in a parliamentary democracy like Canada's. And the first is you have to have public notice that some kind of change to legislation is happening. And then you've got to have information provided to the public that is sufficient to allow debate, pro and contra. There has to be participation. Then there's got to be meaningful consultation in the province by the members of the Legislative Assembly with their constituents and with the people concerned that the legislation concerns. This doesn't mean that you can bring in someone like Caton and have him write a report, bring him in from some other country, and he's not even competent to write the report, and you say, well, this is meaningful consultation. No. It's when you are introducing major changes to the legal system in a province, you've got to have meaningful consultation with those affected and with your constituents. Then, of course, there's the voting. So you could say, well, these bills, they were voted on and they passed and they've become act. Isn't that democratic? Well, in the case of the HPOA and the Legal Professions Act, we can say, no, it doesn't look like it was passed democratically at all. With the Health Professions and Occupations Act, I believe it may have been the largest bill ever to have been put through the BC Legislative Assembly, somewhere in the vicinity of 270 pages. The way that it was passed was the Premier, David Eby. Now, we're talking about a lawyer. So when he does things wrong, it's hard to imagine that he doesn't realize he's doing these things in a way that is contrary to established democratic process. So he closed the Legislative Assembly. So it was a vote forced through closure. And then his party voted en bloc, all together, unanimously. And
Excuse me, Dr. Cockle.
Yep.
For those that don't know that phrase, he closed the legislature. Did he close the physical building, or did he close it to the public? Did he shut down the legislature?
He closed it as in he shut down its operation. So, all of a sudden, there's no more legislative assembly operating. Well, the legislative assembly is where our elected representatives go to debate the laws that are being passed and that will then be imposed upon us. They're our representatives, and they're also, they have a guardianship role with respect to democracy. And what that means really is that they have a guardianship role with respect to our rights and freedoms in relation to laws that are going to be imposed. Now, so he forced closure of the Legislative Assembly, and then there was a vote, and the entire party votes in a certain way. When this happens, very often we assume, okay, well, there's a party whip who is pushing this vote in a certain way. Now, this isn't something one can prove, so it's entirely speculative, so we can leave it aside. But what we do know is that the members of the Legislative Assembly had not fully read and debated this bill in the Legislative Assembly. They hadn't gone through it. Now, if they haven't gone through it and then they vote to pass it, they do not know, they have not processed the laws they are now imposing on the province. That means they cannot pretend to have the tacit consent of the public they represent. There's no consent there at all. They don't even know what they have passed. It's completely unacceptable. It's completely anti-democratic. Now, beyond that, when we look into the legislation itself, well, the HPOA, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, it allows some very concerning things to happen. So one of these is you have a whole bunch of appointees that will be put in charge of our healthcare system. But beyond this, there is a way in which these appointees, you can bring in legislation into the BC framework through this sort of health portal. You can bring legislation into the BC framework without passing through the Legislative Assembly at all. You can bring it in from foreign jurisdictions, whether those are, that could be Switzerland, it could be Saudi Arabia, and also from foreign rulemaking bodies. So you can bring in legislation that's been drafted by the WHO, and it can go right into our province. It can become law for us, and our elected representatives won't need to discuss it, won't need to approve it. Well, that's bypassing democracy entirely. And basically what we saw during the declared pandemic, and I say declared pandemic because, of course, for those who have studied this, COVID didn't represent pandemic in the traditional sense of an extreme increase in all-cause mortality and in deaths in countries. They had to change the definition to call it a pandemic. We did see a spike in all-cause mortality, but that occurred after the rollout of the mRNA genetic vaccines. So it's technically more correct to say the declared pandemic. So one of the things that we saw during the declared pandemic was the use of emergency powers to suspend citizens' rights and freedoms. Now, and their right to access to information, right? I mean, there was no informed consent, and you couldn't get information because of the massive censorship that was taking place. So what happens with the HPOA is that many of these emergency measures that suspended rights and freedoms, now they're enshrined in law. Now they're legislated into permanence. And so this is also true of the Legal Professions Act. Now, the Legal Professions Act was passed not through closure of the Legislative Assembly, but my understanding is that only 9% of it was read before it was passed into act. And it is a disastrous act. And if the HPOA deprives residents of BC, deprives them of access to the type of healthcare that we've had traditionally, that we've offered in Canada, personalized healthcare, not one size fits all, not coercive, mandated one size fits all treatment, but the personalized healthcare that is based on the rights of the patient to informed consent, that's out the window. And with the Legal Professions Act, one of the things that happens is it becomes very difficult indeed for residents of BC to seek remedy when their rights and freedoms have been infringed. And I'm going on quite at length here, and I'm sorry about that, but this leads us to the second point, and that is with respect to the judiciary in Canada's ability to provide remedy for individuals whose rights and freedoms have been infringed. Now, during the declared pandemic, the population, so very many people were coerced into receiving injections with the mRNA COVID-19 genetic vaccines. We were told they were safe and effective, even while we were told, well, they're not finished the stage 3 clinical trials. That's a little bit like I'm selling you a seatbelt, but we haven't finished testing it, but I'm going to say it's safe and effective. I'm going to trademark it as safe and effective. Well, that's absurd, and it's marketing. So the safe and effective slogan is a marketing slogan. It is not a scientific reality, and that's something that now we're dealing with because we see these spikes in excess mortality. And as the Public Health Agency of Canada and Health Canada have acknowledged, there are a lot of problems with those genetic vaccines. And so if you are someone who has been injured by these vaccines, well, it's going to be difficult for you to seek compensation, to seek remedy. Why is that? It shouldn't be. You've got something you've been coerced into taking an injection, and we've got international human rights law on this. It's not just Canadian law. Canada has signed treaties that are binding on Canada, and those treaties are very clear. People can never be forced, even in wartime, to accept to be forced to undergo medical experimentation or to accept medical treatment not voluntarily chosen. So there should be remedy. Well, what has happened is we have a judiciary in Canada that is very, very reluctant to listen to expert witness testimony about the dangers of these vaccines. And so it's incredibly difficult for people who come before the courts to achieve anything like just redress for their injuries. How has this come to pass? Well, at the federal level and then at the provincial level, there were these action committees formed. And David Eby, who's the Premier of BC, was instrumental. He's a part both of the federal and the provincial action committees. And what they did was they went around to the courts, they went around to the judges, and not only the judges, but also the civil liberties associations. And they made it very clear that the way to get through the pandemic was to defer at all costs to the Public Health Agency of Canada. And whatever advisory they had up on their website, that's what the courts should go by. Now, we're talking about information that appears on a government website that changes all the time, and most of which has been retracted at one point or another. The information given out by the Public Health Agency of Canada with respect to COVID-19, that has not proven to be 100% correct, not by a long shot. There's constant need for revision, and that's normal. What is not normal is for the judiciary to defer to an agency of the government. Now, the Public Health Agency of Canada is part of the administrative state. That is, it is an extension of the executive branch that administers laws, right? That administers the legislation that comes from the legislative branch. So we're in a parliamentary democracy. There are three branches of government: legislative making the laws, the executive branch that executes them, and then the judiciary. And the judiciary has a very important role. Its role is guardianship of rule of law democracy. And that means that it reviews legislation, it reviews the actions of the legislative and executive branch, and to ensure that they are not infringing the rights and freedoms of the people represented within this democratic country, within this country ruled by the demos, the people. So when the judiciary defers to the administrative state, in this case, PHAC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and refuses, as a result of this deference, refuses to hear expert witness testimony that shows clearly the overreach of the legislative and executive branch and the overreach of PHAC and the manner in which these branches of government and these agencies within the administrative state of Canada have infringed upon the rights and freedoms of Canadians. When the judges refuse to hear this, then they're not fulfilling their primary role, which is as the guardians of rights-based rule of law democracy. And so then when the judiciary doesn't do that, when we don't have an independent, competent judiciary, we do not have effective democracy. So again, this is an enormous problem. So on the one hand, now we've got Governor General Mary Simon, and poised to appoint an unelected individual who clearly represents global banking interests as the Prime Minister of Canada, which is supposed to be a liberal democracy. We have a judiciary that is deferring to the administrative state. And the administrative state, the roles are made up of appointees. They're not elected. So again, this is a blow to our democracy. And another blow to our democracy is, in a democracy, we have a right, in liberal democracies, we have the right to information. And, you know, this too is under attack. And everybody knows, okay, well, the CBC is not very reliable anymore. It seems to just give us one side of the story. There's no balanced reporting. There was no balanced reporting whatsoever on COVID. They never reported the possible dangers of the vaccines. They haven't reported on the enormity of the injuries and deaths and bereavements. But one signal example of the way in which our democracy is under attack, specifically in relation to people's right to information, is we had the federal leaders debate. I think it was 2.5, 3 years ago, and they wanted to exclude journalists from rebel news media, and so a judge ruled that they couldn't do that, that they had to include them. And I believe there were, I may be wrong about this, but I believe there were 11 journalists representing rebel news at that leaders debate. And to my recollection, they were the only journalists there who were asking the difficult questions about COVID-19 and about the mandates and the pandemic policies. They were asking questions that I and my family wanted to hear answers to. And everybody I know wanted to hear answers to those questions. This is not the same as me saying, I support Ezra Levant and I support Rebel News. I don't support Ezra Levant's position on Israel. Obviously, Canada has a clear duty to oppose genocide. So I completely disagree with Ezra Levant's position on that. And it seems to me his background is as an oil lobbyist. Now, whatever the case may be, I'm not going to be cheerleading for Ezra Levant. That said, these journalists from Rebel News were there asking difficult questions, and I wanted to hear the answers to them. And all the candidates, after being ordered by a court to include these journalists, refused to answer them. Well, as I've pointed out in letters to Jagmeet Singh, who is his local constituency is in Burnaby, I believe, in Vancouver, and he's the leader of the federal NDP. So as I pointed out to him, by refusing to answer these questions, he's depriving, right, all of these candidates, including the Green Party candidates. I couldn't believe it. They're depriving Canadians of their right to information of enormous public consequence at a debate that is supposed to ensure access to information. And that is an open attack, an open assault on democracy, right there, right, recorded for the whole nation to see. Here we are, all of us who are pretending to want to represent our constituents are actively opposing Canadians' right to information and undermining democracy. Well, this is unconscionable. So how does this happen? Does this happen because they don't understand the responsibilities attendant upon representatives within a parliamentary democracy, within a system of parliamentary democracy? Maybe there is an education component that is missing. It may be that at the city council level and at the level of the legislative assemblies in the provinces, and also at the federal level with our members of parliament and our senators, maybe there is an education component missing with respect to what liberal democracy is, what its principles are, how parliamentary democracy runs, and what the real responsibilities of these individuals, these elected individuals, are towards their constituents. That does seem like a possibility. Now, how can we correct this? I'm not entirely sure. I think what we need is a democratic renaissance. Now, the Renaissance, it's the French word, renaissance. It just means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Well, then it was the rebirth of classical culture, the culture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It was driven by an influx of manuscripts, and manuscripts that contained a great deal of information that had been lost to Western Europe. And so you could get access to this by renewing your understanding of the language, the ancient language. If you could read ancient Greek, you could unlock what was in these manuscripts. And so we had this sort of jumpstart to all these different disciplines. Now, what we need now is a democratic renaissance. That is a rebirth of democratic culture. And what is going to be the motivating force that drives this kind of the education we need? I think, one of the things is we've got to have accountability for our elected representatives, and not the fake kind of accountability that the parties send out in their newsletters calling for donations. I get plenty of those. They drive one crazy. But, for example, you had the former SS Waffen officer, so a Ukrainian officer, now, who openly discusses fighting. So he's giving a speech to the Canadian Parliament at the federal level. And he openly discusses fighting against the Russians in World War II. Well, the Russians were our allies. They are the ones largely responsible for beating the Nazis. What did it cost them? Well, it cost them somewhere, estimates put it between 24 and 27 million people died in Russia. And so when this man is finished telling the parliament that he fought against the Russians, they give him not one, but 3 standing ovations. He was an SS Waffen officer fighting with the Germans against the Russians, against us, against our allies. If this man gave that same speech in a high school auditorium filled with grade 11 and 12 senior students who had taken some history, they'd just studied a little bit of World War II, I do not think he would have received that standing ovation. I think that many people would have left because they would have realized, wait a second, this man was fighting with the Nazis against the Russians. Over 20 million people died. This is not something to be applauding. This is not something to be smiling and laughing about. This is in no way commensurate with the principles of liberal democracy. This is in no way aligned with our values. And there's a problem. So Canadians we don't want to massacre people. None of us. It is not, no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, okay, let's see, where can we drop bombs on kids? So Canadians, we don't want the equivalent of 5 or 6 nuclear bombs dropped on the Palestinians living in Gaza. We don't want to support that. We don't want to support genocide. We don't want continued war in Ukraine provoked by NATO, this bizarre proxy war between Russia and NATO. We don't want to encircle China with nuclear bases. We don't want to encircle Russia. With military bases, I mean. And I think Canadians, we've been hoodwinked for a very long time. Back when I was at SFU, Simon Fraser University, back in the late 90s, Indonesia was in the process of genociding the East Timorese. And I guess Canada had some major investment in Indonesia, and perhaps in its resource extraction ventures in East Timor. I'm not sure. But what I do know is that the federal government was paying SFU for its engineering program in Indonesia, even while Indonesia was genociding East Timorese. And when this was drawn to the attention of the administration at a forum that Jerry Zaslav and the Institute for the Humanities, they had this citywide, Vancouver-wide forum on fascism and the spectacular state, sort of the way in which fascism and totalitarianism and other authoritarian systems continue to influence us in the modern day. And so one of these forums was on SFU's involvement, training engineers in Indonesia. And, at the president of SFU at the time was John Stubbs. And there he was arguing that, well, we have to be improving things because we're educating people. It's just silly. This is the type of baby talk that has gotten us in serious trouble. The idea that, well, as long as you go to a good school, everything's okay. Well, there aren't any good schools. There are schools with high rankings. What we have to look at is, what are these schools doing? Are they behaving ethically? How are they governed? UBC, its board of governors, isn't it mostly business interests and government that dominate that board of governors? It's not mostly students, staff, and instructors. Now, does that mean that if those representatives taken from government and local industry, that they want to do something unethical, then they're going to win the vote, aren't they? So then the university can't actually act ethically, at least not the body of students, staff, and instructors. That's what we need to look at. We need to stop with the rankings. We need to, and even with the discussion of tariffs, the question should be, is Canada behaving like a democracy? Is it upholding the principles of rights-based rule of law democracy? Is it opposing things like genocide? Canada kept on funding Indonesia throughout its campaign against East Timor. It didn't stop. And throughout Suharto's regime, I believe Indonesia was the third largest recipient of Canadian aid. Well, once he came into power, he killed 1 million. My understanding is that it killed 1 million Indonesians, death squads. Well, most Canadians, all Canadians, don't want to support that kind of thing, right? We don't want to sell, what was it, $14.5 billion worth of light armored tanks to the Saudis, which may have been used against the Yemeni people. We don't want that, right? We don't. There are problems.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely. I'm just going on and on. My apologies.
No, it's fine. I let you go because you're such a fantastic speaker. As you were talking, the amount of questions, follow-up questions were piling up. So let's work through this backwards. You mentioned the tanks we sold to Saudi Arabia. My personal opinion, at some point we transitioned from a peacekeeping nation to a warmongering nation. It seems like we're trying to get into the war game or the arms game. How did that happen? Why did it happen? Do you think it's a good thing? I'm assuming you think it's a bad thing. What are your thoughts?
Well, on principle, I'm not opposed to Canada having a military or countries having militaries. I'm not necessarily even opposed to some kind of military service, but I certainly am opposed to exporting death. Like, Canada shouldn't be selling arms to nations that are engaged in aggression against their neighbors. The business of killing is very big business indeed. But Canadians don't want to make money killing people. When you drop bombs, you kill people. You can find polite ways to say it, but it's not real. When you kill a man, he dies. It doesn't matter what costume he's wearing, what country he's from. It doesn't matter how you insult him or insult his family or his memory or what you think of his religion. This other man has died. And Canadians don't want to participate in exporting murder. This is not good business. If we need an arms industry to supply our own army, that's one thing. But killing people overseas, that's no good. And I mean, it's a very complicated sort of web that one gets into, because then you have these major contractors who are involved, like SNC-Lavalin, and the Prime Minister's office is sheltering them from scrutiny. And and maybe you have the involvement of our intelligence community. We have the former civilian oversight of CSIS was somehow involved with, what was his name?
The Michelle gentleman?
Pardon me?
Michelle? Are you talking about that Michelle gentleman?
No, I've forgotten his name. It may come back to me, but he was I think the last civilian oversight that we had for CSIS. And he was involved with SNC-Lavalin with the scandal relating to the University of Montreal Hospital, I believe. And I think he died in a Panamanian prison. And there's all kinds of allegations of misconduct there, and money laundering. And I wish I could remember his name. But that case, the case with the tanks going to Saudi Arabia, and what we can't do is we can't allow these enormous firms that are operating out of Canada to engage in criminal activity or to be profiting off of just war profiteering. How many Canadians is that? That's not a Canadian slogan. We do war profiteering. We're up there with the best of them. We're competing with the US for who can make more money killing abroad. The Americans don't want that either. That's why they protested Vietnam. Right? The people, regular people, don't want that. And so I think that the answer there is, we're in a democracy. Maybe we need to have a lot more referenda. We need to start having referendums about things like, are we going to sell $14.5 billion worth of light armored tanks or whatever else to Saudi Arabia when they're in a conflict with Yemen? I think that we would get an overwhelming response from the people of Canada. No, we don't want that. And maybe a referendum would have been very helpful with respect to coercive mandates. Instead, we have Trudeau strutting back and forth on a stage in something that looks like a high school football jacket, saying, if you think being unvaccinated, that you're going to sit down next to a vaccinated person on a plane or a train, you've got another thing coming. We're going to exclude you. We're going to make your life miserable. And we're going to mistreat you. And we're going to vilify you in the media. And we're going to make sure that there's no redress, that that this will happen to you, and it can be a lesson to everybody. Just keep your head down and do what you're told. Well, keeping your head down and doing what you're told that's what happens in Pinochet's regime. That's what happens in an authoritarian regime. That's not what happens in a liberal democracy. And despite what the WEF may think, despite what maybe Chrystia Freeland thinks, Canadians do want democracy. And they want the rights and freedoms for themselves and also for their neighbors, for their family, for their loved ones, for everybody preserved. So I don't think I've answered your question quite properly, but
you did with the referendum thing. You actually did. Dr. Cockle, I want to ask one more question. We got about 10 minutes. I got to run. Um, the concept of democracy. Let's go back to the BC legislature, the HPOA. You mentioned that they closed the legislature and then they voted on it. So that's not democratic. I'm not disagreeing with you. This is like a devil's advocate question. Maybe your adversary would ask, isn't it democratic? Like, there's nothing that would have stopped the opposition MLAs from just voting no, saying, no, you didn't give me a chance to read this. I'm not reading it. I represent the constituents in my riding. I stand on integrity. But it seems like, what is the saying? In a democracy, you get the leadership you deserve. I'm trying to blame it on the voters, to take personal responsibility ourselves.
Well, okay. You're making a very good point, and so I'm going to mention our former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Suzanne Anton, and not pretending to be speaking for her at all, but I have watched an interview that conducted by Corinne Morey, who has represented the terminated nurses in BC. And she interviewed Suzanne Anton, and Suzanne Anton, she expressed a similar opinion. She said, we never saw any evidence, any basis for the policies, for the mandates. And she also said, and I'm quoting loosely here, one would have to check that video, but she said something along the lines of, people share a great responsibility because governments can only impose laws when the people agree to them. And there wasn't enough resistance. She said she protested, but maybe not enough. I mean, she was speaking for a lot of people, I think, when she said that. And she said, I wonder what would have happened if all the restaurateurs, if everybody had just said, no, these, the 6 foot distancing rules, the masking rules, they don't make any sense. We're just not going to follow them. Right? Then that would have been it. And so her point was, and she said, we ought not to have complied. And that's a very strong statement when it comes from a former Attorney General and Minister of Justice. Because this is someone who knows the law and who's saying, okay, we have policies in place, we have laws in place that they're not correct. Now, I would say, okay, they're unlawful, but technically they might not be, because to be unlawful, technically a judge has to find them unlawful. But there are certainly grounds whereby a judge might, and I think ought, to find them unlawful. That the legislation and policies that were imposed upon us during the declared pandemic. Now, so addressing your question, what about the members of the Legislative Assembly who have allowed the Emergency and Disaster Management Act and the Health Professions Occupations Act and the Legal Professions Act, all of these, I think, anti-democratic legislation, openly anti-democratic legislation, incredibly destructive for BC. But how did this happen? How could they have allowed this to happen? And don't we get the representatives we deserve? Well, to some extent we do. But in a democracy, as I said before, there is a right to information. It's covered by international human rights law. It's covered by treaties. It isn't something that's made up. We have the right to information. And what has happened is we've seen a move to monopolize the media. And so you have post-media controlling so many, not just the big papers, not just the Province and the Sun, but these little papers all across the province. If you do not have free and independent media, if you do not have a broad range of voices that are allowed to speak, and then you have suppressed the right to information. And without the right to information, you cannot have effective democracy. And so where is this going? What I'm trying to say is, in a system where your access to information is incredibly limited, it becomes very difficult for you to know how things are, what's happening. How are you being governed? What are these people actually doing? All you hear is a very one-sided account, which aligns with certain powerful interests. Well, if you're struggling to make ends meet at home, if you're struggling to sort of pay your mortgage and you'd like to get your kids into some kind of activity in the summer, the way most of us do, and you're concentrating on that, then you're not one of the powerful interests being represented by post media, right? These big media monopolies that we see, right, all over the Anglosphere in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. These prevent us from having access to balanced information. So what we need is, first, we need to sort of, now, many people say, well, the answer is get rid of the CBC. It's not doing its job. The CBC is a public broadcaster. It belongs to us. They're not doing their job. They have to start. But the answer is not sell it off to the private sphere. No. They have lobbied and influenced and pressured our government representatives, our elected representatives, to get them to co-opt our public broadcaster. The public sphere belongs to us, the public. Public institutions, right? Public utilities like BC Hydro, they belong to us. Now, someone comes along and cripples BC Hydro, so it looks like it can't manage itself. But really what's happening is that person has been lobbied or bribed or cajoled in some way to hamstring this public utility because it's so successful. And if you can keep it hamstrung long enough, then you can convince the public, using your media monopoly, that maybe it needs to be handed over to the people who do everything right, the private sector. Well, they've caused it to be crippled, and now they're buying it, and they're going to make a ton of money off of it. The answer is, we have to say, no, the public broadcaster is ours. These people need to be held accountable. They have to provide real journalism. They're our public broadcaster. And, Trudeau's cabinet needs to stay out of it. Can't be calling the shots on what gets reported. And I guess that's one last thing that really needs to be said is Trudeau's cabinet, Klaus Schwab, he has kind of laughed when he gave that talk at I think it was the Kennedy Business School at Harvard. And he laughed about, or he was so proud. What we are very proud of is we have penetrated the cabinets with our young global leaders. And I happen to know that, Trudeau's cabinet, half, maybe more than half, are ours, young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Well, I mean, obviously that's disastrous for democracy when half of the cabinet of the prime minister they've come through a program, a globalist program designed by unelected global elites who are referred to as your excellencies at the opening of WEF ceremonies. That is, your excellencies, the aristocrats, the aristocracy, the true leaders, the ones who matter. So what Trudeau's cabinet has done, besides brutalizing peaceful protesters in Ottawa, and they were peaceful, anybody can look at the evidence presented by CSIS, by the Ottawa police, in the inquiry. All of these different agencies were telling the government, you should negotiate with the protesters. It's a real mixed bag. We've got retired police officers, we've got veterans, we've got old people. They're playing hockey, they're cleaning up, they're giving out food, there's barbecues. And when you look at footage from the Ottawa protests, it looks like a Canada Day celebration. I've spoken to people who their entire lives participated in protests, anti-nuclear protests, all kinds of things, who have told me they've never been to a protest that was this loving, that there was this kind of sort of, a spirit of mutual aid and kindness. It was a very incredibly positive, Canadian. It was a great Canadian accomplishment. And so then to invoke the Emergencies Act and to just brutalize the protesters and then also freeze people's bank accounts just to show that we can, this is horrifying, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. So one thing that the cabinet can do, that the Prime Minister's office can do, is it can sort of create a secret council. It can pass these secret orders in council. And these are laws that get passed that have an effect on Canadians, and Canadians aren't privy to them. We don't get to see what they are. And neither does the Parliament, just the members of this secret council. So secret orders in council. What could be less democratic? What could be more in violation of the principles of liberal democracy? Well, it's hard to imagine anything that could be less democratic. So how many did they pass? 2, 3, 10? That would be terrible. No, more than 70.
Well, welcome to Canada.
That's, yeah. So what I've described going on at far too great length, and I thank you for being so patient, Payman, is, our democracy is under attack in Canada. And if Mary Simon goes ahead and appoints Mark Carney, who's an unelected representative of global banking, well, isn't that going to be a death blow to democracy when the prime minister in a democracy is unelected, hasn't lived in the country for over 10 years? That doesn't sound even remotely democratic. Right? That sounds like there's a really big problem here. And Canadians need to realize that we're on a precipice. And we look back at the history of the 20th century. What happens when countries lose democratic governance? Like, was Pinochet's rule, was that fun? Indonesia under Suharto, is that a good thing? And we supported it. Canada shouldn't be transitioning away from democracy. What we need to restore democracy. We need to restore our public sphere. And the way we need to do that is everybody needs to participate. And I think that means running as independents in the legislative assemblies in the provinces, getting on your city council, participating in school boards, in everything. Right? That's what the political parties do. They like to stack the municipalities and sort of build a power base. But what I'm not talking about a political party that has its agenda and they're career climbing. I'm talking about regular people who just want a better society, right? And responsible government for themselves and their children, their families and their friends, and for everybody. We just need to participate a lot more, and maybe we need to get out in the streets and let our elected representatives know that we want democracy to be a real. We want real democracy. We want them to do their jobs. We want them to take their responsibilities seriously. Thanks,
Dr. Cockle. I wanted to thank you very much for coming on. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more than an hour. If you want to come back, you're more than welcome to. You did a fantastic job of explaining what all of us feel, but we can't necessarily piece together. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Payman.
Have a wonderful day. And we'll do our best to get this out because it's important for Canadians to hear what you just told us. Thank you.
Great. Cheers.
Bye.